Chapter 7 The Chapel Perilous. Sir Lancelot seeks adventure. Sir Lancelot du Lac rode out of Camelot in search of adventure. He rode for many days until he found a forest full of tall trees that hid the sun. There were many paths through the trees, but Lancelot did not know which one to take. Suddenly, a white hunting dog came out of the trees. The dog put its nose to the ground and ran along one of the paths. "Perhaps the dog will lead me to its master," thought Lancelot. So Lancelot followed the dog along the path. Lancelot looked at the ground and saw that there was a trail of blood on the path. The dog was following the trail of blood, and Lancelot followed the dog. The dog kept turning its head to look at Lancelot. The dog led Lancelot out of the forest. They went over a bridge to a large house. When the dog ran into the house, Lancelot got off his horse. He went into the house and saw a knight lying on the floor of the hall. The knight was wearing black armor. Blood ran from many wounds on the knight's body. He was dead. Lancelot heard a sound outside the house. He went outside and saw a lady in the garden. Her hands were covering her eyes and she was crying. The Curse of Lady Gilbert. "What has happened?" Lancelot asked. The lady took her hands from her face and raised her head. Lancelot saw that she had an ugly red mark on her face.
"Sir Meliot came here," answered the lady. "He fought my husband and killed him, but Sir Meliot was wounded in the fight. The wound will never heal and Sir Meliot will die."
"I know Sir Meliot," said Lancelot. "He is a knight of the Round Table at Camelot. He is a good and honourable knight." The lady looked angrily at Lancelot.
"Go back to Camelot," she cried. "I am Lady Gilbert. My husband, Sir Gilbert, is the dead knight. I can make magic. I have cursed Sir Meliot. Now his wound will never heal. Go, or I will curse you too."
Lancelot quickly left the house. The white hunting dog was waiting for him outside. The dog barked and ran along a path. Lancelot got onto his horse and followed. He rode back into the dark forest. Soon they came to another large house. Another lady was sitting in the garden. She too was crying, but as soon as she saw Lancelot, she dried her eyes. The dog went to the lady and licked her hand. Sir Meliot has a wound that will not heal.
"I know you," said the lady. "You are Sir Lancelot du Lac. You know my brother, Sir Meliot."
"Did Sir Meliot fight with Sir Gilbert today?" asked Lancelot.
"Yes, he did," answered Sir Meliot's sister. "Lady Gilbert is an evil sorceress. She has used magic. She has put a curse on Sir Meliot. He is wounded, and his wound will not heal."
Lancelot went into the house and found Sir Meliot lying in the hall. The knight had a bleeding wound on the left side of his body.
"Only a cloth from Chapel Perilous will heal my brother," said Sir Meliot's sister. "That is what Lady Gilbert told me."
"Then I will go to Chapel Perilous and find this cloth," said Lancelot.
"No man has gone into Chapel Perilous and returned alive," said the lady. "The chapel is in the middle of the forest. The knights who guard it are really dead, but they still seem alive. They are controlled by Lady Gilbert's magic powers."
"I do not fear any knights, living or dead," said Lancelot.
"Then follow this path," said the lady. She pointed to a path through the forest. "The path is too narrow for your horse. You must walk, but Chapel Perilous is not far. Take my dog. The dog will guide you."
Lancelot walked along the path until he came to the middle of the forest. Here he saw a small chapel that was made of dark stones. The shields of many knights were hanging on a tree outside the chapel. These shields were upside down, which was a sign that the knights were dead. The Dead Knights. The knights were standing near their shields. They did not move. Their armor was old and dark, and they held swords in their hands. Lancelot stepped closer to them. The knights turned slowly and looked at Lancelot. He saw their faces and knew that the knights were dead men. These were the knights who had entered Chapel Perilous. The knights opened their mouths, but they could not speak. They looked at Lancelot with empty eyes. Lancelot drew his sword and ran towards the knights. He swung his sword, but it passed straight through the bodies of the knights, and the knights could not strike Lancelot with their swords. The knights who guarded the chapel were ghosts. Sir Lancelot enters the Chapel Perilous. So Sir Lancelot entered the Chapel Perilous. There were no windows in the walls, but many lamps hung from the ceiling. Strange shadows moved on the walls. At the end of the chapel there was a large flat stone. The body of a knight was lying on this stone. Lancelot went to the body and saw that it was covered with a silk cloth. He cut a piece of the cloth with his sword and held it in his hand. Suddenly there was a sound like thunder. Then the floor moved. Lancelot walked back to the doorway and went outside. The dead knight stood in front of Lancelot, and he could not pass. The ghosts did not move their mouths, but Lancelot heard their terrible voices.
"Knight, do not take the cloth from the chapel," they said. "If you take the cloth, you will die, and you will never see Guinevere again."
"Ghosts, you have no power over me," said Lancelot. "Let me pass." Lancelot swung his sword at the dead knights, but he could not fight them. The knights did not have bodies like living men. Instead, they pushed against Sir Lancelot like the thick smoke of a fire. Lancelot swung his sword, but he could not fight smoke. Then, looking up into the light, Lancelot saw the shields that hung on chains above the entrance to the chapel. Lancelot cut at the chains, and the shields began to fall. As one by one each shield fell, one by one a dead knight fell to the ground. When Lancelot had cut down all the shields, all the knights had fallen. Then Lancelot heard a great cry. The Lady Gilbert was standing at the entrance to the Chapel Perilous. She put her hand to the red mark on her face, and then she too sank to the ground. Sir Lancelot takes the cloth to Sir Meliot. Lancelot walked back to the house of Sir Meliot. The sun was bright and birds sang. Lancelot gave the cloth from Chapel Perilous to Sir Meliot's sister. She smiled. "Thank you," she said. Then she led Lancelot to her brother. "The Lady Gilbert is dead," said Sir Lancelot. "I have brought a cloth from the Chapel Perilous to heal your wound." Sir Meliot's skin was pale, and he was near to death. Blood flowed from the wound in his side, but as soon as the cloth touched his wound, the blood stopped flowing. Then Sir Meliot opened his eyes. "I am healed," he said. "Lady Gilbert was an evil sorceress whose real name was Heloise. She was a companion of Morgana Le Fay. The power of Heloise is broken now, but she cast a spell on another lady who lives near this forest, and that spell may not be broken." "I will return to Camelot," said Lancelot, "and I will tell the story of Heloise the sorceress and Chapel Perilous." Sir Meliot and his sister thanked Lancelot. "Farewell," said Lancelot. "Sir Meliot, we will meet again at the Round Table in Camelot." The Fair Maid of Astolat. Lancelot rode through forests until he came to a river that runs down to Camelot. A tall grey tower stood on an island in the river. The island was called the Isle of Astolat. Elaine, the Fair Maid of Astolat, lived in the tall tower. No man had seen Elaine. She lived in the highest room of the tower. The room's walls had no windows, but it was bright because light came through windows in the ceiling. There were many mirrors on the walls that reflected this light. Elaine looked at the mirrors, and she saw the world outside her tower. The Tower of Mirrors. Years before, when the sorceress Heloise gained her evil powers, her face had been spoilt with an ugly red mark. After that, Heloise hated all beautiful women. "No man wishes to see my face," she said, "but all men wish to see the face of the Fair Maid of Astolat, so I will put a curse on her.
If Elaine looks at any man, she will die."
Elaine knew that she could not look at the world outside her tower, and so she watched the world with her mirrors, and she used coloured silk threads to make a tapestry. The tapestry showed pictures of the world. When Sir Lancelot came riding out of the forest, the sunlight flashed on the knight's bright armour. Elaine saw the bright flash in her mirror. She watched the knight as he rode closer to her tower. Lancelot was not wearing a helmet, so Elaine saw his face clearly. Elaine had seen men reflected in her mirror, but she had never met a man, and she had never seen a man as handsome as Lancelot. She did not want the reflection of Lancelot to disappear from her mirror. Forgetting the curse, Elaine ran from her room to the top of the tower. She opened the door and looked down at the knight's handsome face, but Lancelot did not see Elaine. The curse. Suddenly, the room at the top of the tower became dark. Sunlight no longer shone onto the mirrors, and at once there was a great noise. The mirrors had broken, and the floor was covered with broken glass. Elaine fell to the floor. "The curse has come to Astolat," she cried. Then she slowly walked down the stairs of her tower and went outside into the sunlight for the first and last time in her life. She walked to the river. Sir Lancelot rode on towards Camelot. He heard and saw none of these things on the Isle of Astolat. He thought only of Camelot. Castle Camelot was near, and he wanted to see Guinevere again. He thought of telling stories at the Round Table. The death of Elaine. That day there was a feast in Camelot. All the courtiers, knights and ladies, ate and drank in the great hall. King Arthur and Queen Guinevere listened to stories of Sir Lancelot's adventures. But in the middle of the feast, there was a sudden storm outside. The knights, ladies and courtiers went silent, and the musicians stopped playing their music. And in the silence, they heard someone singing a sad song. The music came from outside the castle, from the direction of the river. Everyone went to the windows and looked out from the towers of Camelot. They saw a boat floating along the river. In the boat sat a fair maiden who was singing the sad song. Before the boat reached Camelot, the maiden lay down and died. All the people left the castle and went down to the river. The boat was dressed with brightly coloured cloth, and the maiden lay on soft silk cushions. Her body was covered with a long tapestry, with pictures made from coloured silk threads. The words, "The Maid of Astolat," were written on the boat. Lancelot looked at the dead maiden. "She has a beautiful face," he said.